it was a bargain, I guess. I wouldn't want to say devil's bargain, but that was to not be in the pioneers or the Free German Youth was like a form where you would just take, do I ever want to go to university? Do I ever want to have higher education?
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app or join our emailing list at coldwarconversations.com.
Tilo offers an engaging and personal account of growing up in East Berlin before the fall of the wall. He begins by describing his early childhood in a rundown building in Prenzlauer Berg. Tilo's grandfather on his mother's side was a pastor in the Lutheran church and second in command to a bishop by the end of his career. His grandfather on his father's side had been a teacher and had joined the Nazi Party. After World War II, he was banned from working. Tilo's family faced educational and career limitations due to their religious and political background, compounded by the pervasive influence of the Stasi and party loyalty in determining one's future. Tilo also recounts experiences of attending school with a strong military and ideological indoctrination. Despite these challenges, he describes a vibrant underground punk scene and moments of resistance against the regime. The story reflects on the significant social-political changes, including the impact of Chernobyl, the introduction of Glasnost, and the unexpected persistence of Nazi elements in East German society. I'm delighted to welcome Tilo to our Cold War conversation.
So I was born in East Berlin in 1970, and my parents were, I guess today you'd say middle class, but the concept didn't quite exist back then. So my father was a scientist, he was a physicist, and my mom was a nurse, essentially. I have one older brother. And for the first couple of years, we lived in this rundown building. I hardly have any memories. It's in Prenzlauer Berg, so nowadays very much sought after, but back then a bit of a dark hole with lignite coal and cold water running and all that. So we moved to a brand new building in 74, 75, I think. And the whole neighborhood was all just constructed at the very same time. So it all felt very new. And these were all these prefab houses, which no doubt are familiar to your listeners. And that's where I grew up, essentially. So everybody who moved in there had children, pretty much. That was a setup that you didn't qualify unless you had children, I think. But it was quite egalitarian in that sense that you could have someone driving a lorry or a scientist, a policeman, a teacher, a manual worker. They would all live in the same sort of apartment.
And this was in Lichtenberg, yeah?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Isn't that sort of like Stasi Central?
Well, I mean, they rearranged the boundaries, but Lichtenberg is a pretty big borough, I would say. And the end of Lichtenberg, where I grew up, was closer to the center of the city. So no, I would say it was not dominated by Stasi in any sense.
And with your parents, what were their backgrounds in terms of, their parents and their story?
Right. So you could say that in the sense of, we had these little markers in the class books. The head teacher, they had this big book and they would put all the grades in there. And alongside the name of each student in class, they would have a letter saying A, I think, for Arbeiterklasse or Proletariat, the most sought after classification. And then you could be I as in Intelligentsia, which was, maybe a bit doubtful. You could be for or something for other, I guess. And then you could be farmer, but there weren't any farmers in the area. And so my parents came from a bourgeois background, as it were. And as such, we were not privileged in access to higher education and all that. So my mom's father, my grandfather, he was a pastor in the Lutheran church, and he pretty much rose through the ranks. So he was like a second in command to a bishop at the end of his career. And my father's dad, my grandfather, was a teacher. And he was actually wounded in the Second World War. He was blind and he was teaching blind children. And I knew all of them. We visited them regularly and all that. So, but being a teacher in the Third Reich. He had joined the Nazi party. I'm not quite sure whether that was obligatory or not, but that didn't help him, obviously, after the war. So he was banned from working for a number of years. And I'm not quite sure how they survived economically, but then he could rejoin the workforce and he actually taught blind children. And so that's the background. So in the sense of, do you have the right parentage and grandparents? Very much no, I would say. It's all there, right? So priests and Nazis and factory owners and whatnot.
So intelligentsia was sort of like the category you didn't necessarily want to be in, because in the workers and farmers state.
Right. The ironic thing was that the people working in the party, like in the party itself, full time, or if you were an officer, if you were in the Stasi, that all counted as proletariat, because obviously you're serving the proletariat, you're the vanguard of the working class, so why not? But it just served to sort of, open the gates for the children of the ruling people, I suppose.
And you mentioned a sort of communal atmosphere. So you got on well with the neighbors within your Plattenbau?
You like some neighbors, other neighbors are, you keep your distance. But there was one family where the dad was rumored to be Stasi. And so, we kept our distance to them. They also happened to be having the house book was a weird thing. If you had overnight visitors, especially from the West, then you would have to register them with the police, but you would also have to register them in this house book with the guy living upstairs, basically. And that could be cross-checked, I suppose, but it was just a way of making sure that these registration things were followed, I guess. And generally speaking, the people who kept the house book were of the towing the party line types, if not Stasi themselves. But
Your elementary school, what was that like? Was that close to the Plattenbau? Did they build all new schools in that area as well?
It was very close because it was very densely built up, and all the houses either had 5, 10 or 20 stories. And if you only have families with kids moving in, you can imagine that there's a lot of demand for schools. So they also had built 2 brand new schools, and they just had running numbers like number 37, number 38. And classrooms were filled. And those schools in East Germany, they generally ran from grade 1 through to grade 10, and only afterwards had a university track or not. So you stuck with your class, with your 30, 29, 31 kids for 10 years, essentially, because there wasn't much to choose from. Like, I think maybe from grade 8 onwards, you got to choose between arts and music. And you could choose between English and French, whereas Russian was mandatory. But that was about it. So you had this very close group of kids through 10 years. And you either got along or you didn't, I guess. But there wasn't this back and forth between classes and courses and whatnot.
Within your sort of group of friends, did you have, friends where their parents were either part of the security forces or party members?
No, to be honest, but I was keeping up with the guys and I got invited to birthday parties and whatnot, but I had one close friend and his parents were of the same type, I would say, as my parents. So they were in church, they were cultured, they had this university background and all that, and they were certainly not in the party. I'm not sure whether my parents would have sort of stopped me, I think, but they would have maybe not furthered me being friends with someone from a family like that, because that could have been a problem of sorts,
Yeah.
But
did they sort of tell you, okay, this conversation we're having now, don't mention it outside the home and that sort of thing?
The funny thing is I don't ever remember such a conversation, but it was kind of assumed, I guess. And we had this, we would meet for dinner. We had dinner together every evening, and oftentimes we would watch the West German news channel afterwards, Tagesschau, and we would discuss that. And it was always a given that around the family table there would be an open discussion, but some things you would keep close to your vest, basically, when you're in school or especially among strangers. And I'm sure they didn't discuss some stuff with us when we were little, but later on it was always kind of clear there is this one protocol for family and another for a couple of close friends. And then there is the outside world where you have to be more guarded, I guess.
And your parents' view of the regime was just sort of keep your head down and try and fly below the radar, or what was their attitude there?
We didn't have these categories back then of sort of, here's the opposition and there's the party faithful and whatnot, because even to call yourself opposition would be like, you'd be inviting a jail sentence essentially. But I would classify them as distanced. So they meant no ill to socialism, I think, but they had their own view. And the defining marker was probably that we went to church regularly, which was quite rare already in the 80s, was discouraged. And we had relatives and friends in West Germany and even in other countries of the West. I mean, everybody watched Western television and listened to Western radio if they had access to it. But those two markers were more rare, I would say, and they informed our view because we had frequent interactions also with relatives from the West and just sort of could calibrate our opinion, I suppose. Yeah. But they didn't want to go to jail. They were very active in church. In fact, they helped create a new church in our neighborhood. They were in church council and all that, but you could do that if you weren't terribly interested in a career. And if you watched your step, then that wouldn't be a recipe for disaster necessarily.
Yeah. And did that impact their career progression, do you think?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, my mom had very good grades in high school, and that was in the late 50s, sort of at the crest of the first Cold War, if you will, right around the time of the building of the Berlin Wall. But she couldn't go to university, even though she was top of the class, because her dad was a pastor, basically, and she couldn't even start an apprenticeship. She had to go to a factory and work for 1 year to prove her worth in the eyes of the working class. And she ended up being a nurse, which, is a respectable profession. But that stays with you, of course, that kind of experience in your youth. So we talked about that openly. And my dad, he was a research scientist. He was well cited. He got all these invitations to conferences and stuff, but he couldn't go because he wouldn't get the visa, couldn't leave the country. And he would certainly not make professor or be sort of like the head of a research group until very late in the game, basically. So I would say more certain avenues were blocked off rather than you being outright penalized, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Your grandparents leave for West Germany in 1977. I presume that's because they're of retirement age at that point?
That's right. That's my high-ranking pastor granddad. They left for West Germany when they reached retirement age, because then East Germany was quite happy to get rid of the pensioners. It's quite a cynical thing in hindsight, isn't it? But right. So they went to West Germany and started traveling. And in fact, they went to the UK right around the time that Prince Charles and Lady Di got married. And when they came back and visited us, they just shared this big bag of memorabilia, like tins full of cake with their pictures on it and so forth. Quite impressive.
Wow. And so did you get many visits from relatives from the West?
We did, actually, yeah, because after a couple of years, my grandparents, they moved from West Germany to West Berlin, I think to be closer to the family mainly. And they would visit us maybe, 4 times a year, something like that. And we also had other relatives in West Germany and in West Berlin. And on top of that, my dad had like colleagues from the West. They would come maybe to conferences or something, and then sometimes they would pay a visit. Yeah, but of course not the other way around. So even though my grandparents were just a couple of kilometers away, basically on the other side of the wall in Berlin, but we couldn't visit them, obviously. Couldn't climb the wall, couldn't get a visa. And that was, as a kid, you just take things for granted, I guess. So it didn't faze me so much. It was later when I was a teenager that I started to sort of, imagine myself going to New York or being in Spain or seeing the Mediterranean, all these things, the things you kind of imagine yourself doing. But then the cold reality is that you wouldn't be able to do that. And the first time that actually hit home, because, I grew up in East Berlin. My mom, she worked in this place as a nurse, which was just a couple of 100 meters away from the wall. So when I got to go to her workplace and meet with her to go shopping or whatever, I would always see the wall. It would be everywhere, like left, right, in the middle of Berlin. It isn't just one direction, but it's just part of the furniture. You just get used to it. But my mom wanted to go to see my grandfather, her father, for his 70th birthday when they were still living in West Germany. You could apply, special circumstances. There is this family reunion, whatever, and her siblings, they got a visa. She didn't. She was the only one who couldn't go. And that was the first time that I really felt this sting of being kind of walled off, left out, kind of with some gray bureaucrats telling you what you should or shouldn't do, right? We had to go to this police station. I think she had, I don't know, I was too little, but she had reapplied or made some kind of formal complaint or something. So we had to go to the police station of Lichtenberg to get that sought, to pick it up or whatever. And they just told her, no, you're not. It's declined, end of the story. Yeah. And she had taken me along, which in hindsight, I think maybe she was trying to make a point that she had these, kids and that she wouldn't just leave her country like that. But as it was, we walked out and she started to cry around the corner. It was my job to kind of console her a little bit, as you do as a 10-year kid. And we settled on the point of pride being that she wouldn't let those policemen, bureaucrats, whatever they were, that she wouldn't let them see her cry. That was a small victory, as it were, but at least you can sort of keep your bearing and not seem weak, just take it stoically, I guess.
It must have been tough for her with her siblings being able to go. Because
especially,
they were also children of a pastor.
Exactly.
So.
If everyone would have been declined, I think it would have been easier to bear. Maybe that's human nature. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. So at school, were you a member of Young Pioneers and the FDJ and those organizations?
I was, yeah. That was sort of, it was a bargain, I guess. I wouldn't want to say devil's bargain, but that was to not be in the Pioneers or the Free German Youth was like a form where you would just tick, do I ever want to go to university? Do I ever want to have higher education? Yes or no? It might have been different in the 60s or 70s, but in the 80s, or at least that was the perception, right? So yeah, I was, and I had my blue shirt, I had my white shirt, but we didn't have school uniforms. So these things were worn for like high occasions, like 1st of May or the beginning of the school year or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
And,
so,
they also organized some stuff, which was all right. It wasn't all just marching and parades and stuff, but most people just, they were just nominal members, and that's what you did basically.
So did you go through the East German sort of like confirmation ceremony?
I did actually. Again, that was something I could have skipped maybe, but that was right around the time that the decision had to be taken whether I should switch schools and go to the university track school. And I think maybe a decision was reached in the family council that I should participate in this atheist confirmation called Jugendweihe. So I did, but the compromise, if you will, was that there was to be no party at our home. Usually you would invite, your relatives and you would get presents and there would be a party and such. But we didn't do any of that. So because I got a real confirmation instead at church, and that's when we had the family party. So I had two confirmations, if you will.
When I hear you talk about this and your family's experiences, it's a tough path to follow here. And I always remind people of this when I'm doing these interviews, is that you didn't know, nobody knew the wall was going to disappear in 1989. So this was going to be your family's life in this.
You had to be willing to take the consequences, I would say. My best friend from elementary school, he was much more involved in church. And he actually, when he got drafted, when he was 18, he just flat out refused. He didn't go And instead, he took a job at a hospital and sent some sort of letter saying that he was doing his sort of civil service or whatever instead. But that wasn't a thing, right? So, but he didn't go to jail either, just nothing happened. And then 1.5 years later, the wall came down, but you couldn't foresee that. So my perspective at the time was that this is where you live and you can leave this country at terrible risk, or maybe sometime later. But for the time being, let's make sure that you get an education.
Did you sort of holiday in Hungary and places like that?
Yeah, we did all that. We just the usual stuff. Even met our West German relatives there. It's all by the book, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, from what I hear, there was quite a lot of Stasi in Hungary, particularly in the late 80s, all over the campsites. So you mentioned going to a senior school. Could you just tell me about, being not of the proletariat or the Arbeitsklasse,
Right.
how did you manage to, attend a senior school?
Right. So, if I had taken the usual route, then the changeover would have been at age 16 after grade 10. And the spots in those university track schools were just very limited. So kind of the assumption was that from each class of 30 kids, maybe 2 or maybe 3 could go, but then they're pushing it. And there were other avenues to get your leaving certificate to go to university, but much longer and more uncertain. And I don't think I would have rated to be one of those 2 or 3 just because the background of my parents and what I wanted to study and so forth. So thankfully, first my brother and I were able to qualify to go earlier to a school which had a particular profile, and in this case, not sports, because there were those schools too, but in this case, it was math and physics, basically. Both my brother and I were just quite good at math, if I may say so. And I guess having a physicist as a dad doesn't hurt. But we also went to math club and, in the summer math camp and whatnot, and took part in these math Olympics and all that stuff. And I really enjoyed that. It wasn't as if, I was just kind of slaving away to get my only chance at a university education. I quite enjoyed it. And the school was meritocratic in the sense that to get in, you had to pass an exam and you had to have sort of the right, math Olympics and this and that. And so my brother got in, my older brother, and so did I. And that was fantastic. It was a very good school. And I'm still in touch with quite a lot of my classmates.
Oh, wow. Because I think, most of my East German guests on the podcast do say that the East German education system was pretty good, obviously, aside from being taught Marxism, Leninism. Would you say the education system was pretty good in East Germany?
It's a bit of a mixed bag, I would say. I cannot take the experience of my senior school as anything really, because the selection of those kids was not ordinary in that sense. But I would say that the natural sciences were very good. And my comparison here is that I later on went on to study at a West German university. And just sometimes we had stuff, and I was like, oh yeah, I had that in school. And my classmates from West Germany didn't. But languages were poor, generally foreign languages. Russian was a joke. Everybody had to do it, but it was just a waste of time. I would have, in hindsight, loved to speak Russian fluently, but I can't. And history was actually quite all right. There was a strong political tinge, but it was much more systematic. And in Germany, education is dealt with by the federal states, and it differs quite a bit, the curricula between different federal states. And that's something which to this day, I don't quite see the point of, because math is math. Why does it have to be different between Hamburg and Lower Saxony?
Your maths teacher was freshly back from service in the Volksarmee.
Yeah, that was actually in my primary school, but I was close to that age, around 14. And so he came in. He was a good math teacher, by the way, but he came in and introduced himself, and he was in his mid-20s, I think, and he had just gotten off his service at the inner German border. So everybody was, of course, kind of like, ooh, you know, what's that about? And somebody was brave enough to ask whether he had to shoot someone, you know, at the border. Kind of a fresh question, I guess. But he said, no. Never had to shoot someone because, you know, if you rack a Kalashnikov rifle, it makes this awful sound. And even if you've never heard it before, then you know this is a weapon and it's aimed at you. So it makes people stop. But the way he told the story was kind of matter of fact, not even bragging. And it sounded like he'd actually done it. And it gave me a chill, actually. Even though I liked him as a teacher, but I couldn't quite form a bond to him after that. So.
Yeah. Wow. I've always wanted to interview somebody who was on the border, but yet to find anybody yet. But if anybody's listening that knows of a Grenztruppen who might be interested in coming on the podcast, then I'd be very interested in speaking to them. At what point did the pressure start in terms of you needing to sign up for the NVA?
Well, I mean, I was going to be drafted. That was clear, but the mandatory service was just 1.5 years. And if you were on the university track, then you would get drafted right after finishing school, like the same summer, pretty much, or in the fall. But the pressure was on for us to at least sign up for twice that time. So to sign up as a corporal or Unteroffizier auf Zeit for 3 years, or in some specialist occupations, even for 4 years. And they would ask you that. I think the first time I was asked was even when I applied for that mathematics school. So at age 14, that was already on the questionnaire. But it really started at like age 15, 16. It just became like continuous. And there was this form which you would sign, and that was it. So it was very clear to everybody in school who had and hadn't signed. And after a year or two, only my best friend and I hadn't signed. So we were kind of sticking out in that sense. And, you know, there was this regular thing in our school, like I think once a year or something, like military political counseling session or something. And it was as awful as it sounds. Basically, I remember this one session very well. I must have been, I think, 16. It was a warm summer day and the sun was streaming through these dusty window panes, like slanting in. And I was sitting there with 3 grown-ups. There was my form teacher, and she was all right, but she didn't say much. And then there was my physics teacher. And then there was the party secretary of the school. So they were bringing out the big guns, basically. And it was mainly my physics teacher. And to this day, I don't know what was driving him, but he was kind of questioning me along those lines, you know, like, so Tilo, are you in support of peace? Or what are you going to say? Of course I am. You know?
Yeah.
Are you aware of the sinister machinations of the American imperialists who are racking up the pressure, blah, 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 you know? Yeah, sure I am, you know. And so do you know that the only way to stop them is to have a well-formed, highly educated army to repel them from aggression? Well, I guess, yeah, sure. Yeah, and you know where this line is leading to. It kind of brings you to the point where you see no other way out as in saying it, yes, I sign up, right? But I wouldn't. I didn't want to like make drastic statements or talk back aggressively. So it was all just dancing around this thing, right? With nobody ever saying out loud, sign here or we're going to stop you from going to university. Because that's what it was all about, right? And so I was saying like, well, you know, I think I'm interested in this field. I want to study. And if I go through the army for 3 years, then I'm going to be out of it. And it's so hard to restart learning and, you know, come up with all these sort of conforming arguments of sorts. But it all just came back and back. And it just felt very, very painful in a stressful way, you know, because either you made the cut or you didn't, right? It's not like you could apply to some other university.
Yeah.
It's all just one system. And it was hot in that room and stuffy. And I had this white shirt on. I was dressed up a little bit and I was just sweating profusely. And the sweat was just running down the inside of my arm and dripping into my shirt. Drip, drip, drip. And yeah, but I got out of there without signing. And yeah.
You mentioned about not going to university there. So did that directly impact that? I mean, did they say, well, that's it, then you're going to end up in a factory or something?
No, but that was the case with many of these things. It was all implied. It was hearsay. It was rumor, but it was very clear that you had no recourse. If something was decided behind closed doors by some bureaucrats with input from the party and the Stasi and who knows what, then that was it. And last summer, I had a class reunion and I spoke to my form teacher who was present in that meeting. And I asked her what might have happened or what wouldn't have happened. And she told me that there was this long form appraisal, like 2 pages written of each high school student who got the Abitur, the leaving certificate to go to university. And that was, well, I wouldn't say secret, but you never saw it as a student. It was just sort of an appraisal and a recommendation to the university system. And if they would write some awful stuff in there, then you would be out of luck. But these mechanics, I was never aware of. I only learned about them afterwards. And she also told me that my physics teacher might have had a special task from the party because he was gearing up to be the new party secretary. And there were these things like, you got this like special target, Parteiauftrag, an order from the party. And he might have volunteered to like convert 1 or 2 students from this class to also sign up for 3 years or something. And he maybe was demonstrating his loyalty to the other party secretary. That's all grown up stuff behind the scenes. And I'm learning about this now some 35 years later. But in hindsight, it seems like quite a ways away from what a good teacher should do, pressure 15-year-old, 16-year-old into doing something they absolutely don't want to do before putting the cards on the table. Seems rather weird.
Yeah, coercing you into doing something you don't want to do just purely for their own career progression.
Yeah, if you put it like that, correct.
Wow. What was the paramilitary training like at school?
For those connoisseurs of a GDR education, it was very much standard. So there was it was continuous in a sense that was baked into many subjects. Like in physics, you wouldn't just calculate a curve, but it would be a trajectory of an artillery gun, or you would fraction and refraction of light. It was explained as a company of soldiers marching down the road, and then one side of the company hits like sand and the other stays on a tarmac, and then the whole thing refracts. So it was ever present in many subjects. But the real paramilitary stuff started when we were 14, I think. 14, 15. And there were like 2 summer camps, which you'd go through. And the first summer camp, I kind of bowed out of on account of some medical thing or other. So I did that with the girls because the girls did civil defense at home and the boys went to these camps. So my first time around, I did civil defense. We still had to wear uniform and we would meet in the school and we had these very boring lectures about the effects of atomic radiation and whatnot. But we would also practice marching and how to make makeshift gas masks. And the glorious finale of this civil defense course was that we practiced clearing up after a bomb attack on our school. But we were the lucky ones, so just imagine if the hit would have been elsewhere. It was all in light. Even at the time, it all seemed very idiotic and far-fetched because we were aware of what nuclear war would look like, right? But so we had these in the gymnasium, the sports hall, they had built this rubble mound, fake rubble mound out of, like you have these different, not instruments, but kind of like stuff to jump over during gym class, this sort of equipment, they had taken it all and put it into this big jumble and put chairs on top and mattresses and whatnot, just so it looked like a rubble mound, I suppose. And they had these mock wounded people in there. Strangely enough, nobody was dead. They were all just wounded.
Mirrors.
Yeah, isn't it? And someone knew their stuff because they had like these really realistic, I haven't seen a real thing, but it looked very impressive, like bones sticking out and gore and whatnot. And we would have to drag them out and apply bandages and partially wearing a gas mask to boot. And that was just a Wednesday for us.
Right.
Right.
You mentioned making makeshift gas masks. How do you make a makeshift gas mask?
Well, yeah, you're asking the right guy, because the technique we were taught was that first you have to have a pantyhose, and then you go collect some gauze and for the fine stuff, and then some rough like linen or just cloth, and you just layer them basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then you twist it around to keep the whole thing together, and then you tie it around your mouth basically, and that's good against dust. But our chemical defense instructor told us that if there is a chlorine gas attack, that we would have to pee on it and then start breathing through that, which thankfully we didn't have to practice.
I mean, this school, as you said, was a new build school. Did it have air raid shelters underneath?
No, yeah, well, sort of, because this was by the way, both my elementary school and my secondary school were exactly the same layout, because that was kind of like the standard new school in East Berlin. So 4 stories, but the basement was a little bit raised. So they had windows in there. So we had a cafeteria in there and stuff. But the way it was raised was that there was this incline in the ground. And we were told, and we actually saw, that there were these stacks of like concrete plates, which were just big enough so you could move them maybe with 4 guys or something. And so the protocol would have been to put them against the window and then to shovel the earth into this, from this burn, basically. Obviously not something you could do when the sirens are going off, but sort of in a time of heightened tension, that would have happened. Yeah.
That's the phrase we had in the UK, build up of heightened tension.
Yeah.
You do get to go to one of the military training.
Right, the second camp, I couldn't or I wouldn't, I don't know, I don't remember, but I did go with the rest of my class to this camp for 2 weeks at the Baltic Sea. And that was like a pre-run for actual army life. Not a whole lot of difference. I think the biggest difference was that I got along with my mates and that I knew them. But we would wear GST uniforms, which were kind of similar to field service uniforms of the East German Army. We would sleep in bunks and we marched and had sports and all this. And we even got to shoot real rifles. They had these submachine guns, which looked like a copy of the AK-47, except they fired 22 rim rounds. So, but in handling and magazine size and everything, the same thing as a Kalashnikov.
Well, so I guess they were trying to make this look fun, to try and make service in the NVA look like it was going to be one big party.
Yeah, but I think it was partially also to just sort of speed it up maybe a little bit, because by the time we got into the army, apart from the specialty jobs, nothing much was like, basic training, nothing in there which I hadn't done as a high school student already, like jumping over a ditch or going over one of these escalade walls, or climbing underneath barbed wire or throwing a grenade. We didn't have live grenades in high school, but we had replicas, the same, shooting a gun, taking care of your uniform, saluting, all of that stuff was already taken care of in a way.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's something so completely alien to the UK. I mean, you did have some schools that had their own cadet force, but that was absolutely a voluntary thing. It wasn't a compulsory thing.
Yeah. Sometimes when I mention something about that to my kids, I feel like I can hardly believe it myself, that's how foreign it is, but there you go. So
what year are we at now and what age are we at?
So I'm graduating high school in 1988. Yeah. And I'm 18, obviously.
And what is the feeling around where the GDR is at this point, and also the influence of Glasnost?
Right. So, I mean, it's hard to generalize because this is East Berlin. Everybody watches television, West German television, that is, and it's a different atmosphere, I suppose, compared to some other areas of East Germany. But I think the whole thing started to really crack with Chernobyl. That was the marker that was sort of like everybody remembers that, and the way that it was kind of this double talk, oh no, nothing's going on. We're this 24 hours a day on the West German television. And we were looking up in the sky like the day after Chernobyl, looking at the clouds, and somebody cracked a joke that the general secretary of the party has ordered the wind to stop at the border.
Ooh,
Yeah.
a bit of a dangerous joke.
Well, and then Gorbachev came along, and that was exciting, because suddenly there was this hope, and it was direct. It wasn't just via West German television. We had this house of Soviet culture in East Berlin where they had a cinema in there and had like book readings and things. And suddenly you could go there and watch exciting films, and we just assumed that the East German communist leadership, who were slavishly following every whim and every little idiocy from Moscow, that of course they would follow suit, right? Because they're doing everything as they do in Moscow. But it turned out, no, not this time. And that was when also I think many of the more party faithful were doubting the whole thing, because it ran counter to this story of that we learned from the big brother in the East, and that what communists in the Soviet Union do is good enough for us. And that was when things really, before that we had Poland, and Poland was walled off. You couldn't go there anymore. And we had friends in Poland. My parents did, not I, but they came back with Solidarność stickers and stuff. So that was exciting, but there was this feeling like they just scourged disaster. They had martial law, and they were like 5 meters away from the Russians coming in. But now there was hope in the Soviet Union itself. And it felt just like we would be left in this little state backwater with nothing to look up to but Erich Honecker. And what a pitiful sight that was,
I think around this time you're attending some punk concerts in East Berlin. Can you tell
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I was never a punk myself, that would be pushing it, but I was mostly wearing black, I was listening to the Peel sessions on BFBS, and I had friends, and we would swap cassettes with the latest Joy Division music and whatnot. So, but there were exciting bands in East Berlin as well, not on the official concert circuit, but they could play churches or some underground clubs and things. So I would go there. And in hindsight, it's amazing how I even learned about this, because obviously there was no internet, and that wasn't on West German television either. So it was all just, someone would know something and they would tell you, and then you would tell someone else. And lo and behold, you would show up somewhere in the evening, and the whole place would be packed with people with black jackets and leather jackets and spiky hair and whatnot. And that was just fun. It was more fun than politics at first, I think. Just because it was just so much more cool and attractive than any of the other stuff, but obviously not super popular with like the security forces and all that, right? But by the time I entered that scene, the real crackdown was already a bit of a past, and there were some bands who sort of got permission to play, and it was all kind of like halfway house, and one of the most infamous concerts I was at was in the fall of 87. And there was a band from West Berlin who were playing, and they had an opener, a band which actually later turned into Rammstein, part of that band. So they were the opener. And they were playing right in a church in Zionskirche in Prenzlauer Berg. And in the middle of the concert, there was an attack of some 30, 40 skinheads, Nazi skinheads. And there was a big fight. And we were like, I don't know, maybe 500, 600 people. And they were just 40. But if you have 500 people who hardly know each other and who are not organized against 40 people who come in there with the intention to break some bones. And that's the difference between sort of a civil society and kind of like a paramilitary formation of sorts. Yeah. So that was pretty bad. And it was kind of hushed up afterwards, but then it couldn't be hushed up anymore. And there were all these big articles about it, because the point was that these guys were from East Berlin. They were Nazis from East Berlin, something which was not supposed to have happened because we were living in a socialist state. And obviously you can't have Nazis in a socialist state. That's all a thing of the West. And for some time they had these articles claiming how they would be kind of like, I don't know, steered or organized from West Berlin or whatever. It was all a bit of a laugh, really. And looking back in the 90s, even today, with AfD and, right-wing radicalism and violence in the East Germany, particularly in the 90s, that didn't start at 1990. It was there before. It was maybe more bottled up, but that was there. But okay, that's a different topic.
Yeah, but I think a really interesting one, because obviously East Germany always portrayed itself as anti-fascist, yet you've got, Nazis existing in East Germany. I mean, one of the things I wonder is whether the security forces found them as useful in terms of doing some of their dirty work and then blaming it on Western provocateurs and that
That's
sort of
still a point of contention, because when we fled from the church, my friend and I, we were seeing trucks, like I saw with my own eyes at least 4 trucks full of policemen. And they were just sitting at the back of the truck and they didn't do anything. So at the time, it felt to us, exactly as you were saying, something which was tolerated or used, maybe. But I did quite a bit of reading on that event, and it seems that, at least at the time, it was just incompetence and lack of signals and planning. But yeah, it could have been. I think not all of it was part of this hidden culture breaking out. I think a big part of that was right in the open, because look at the uniforms. Look at the uniforms of the Volksarmee. They look like Wehrmacht uniforms, and that was intentional, and sort of, we are keeping up the tradition, whereas the West Germans are lackeys of the Americans. Look at them with their baggy pants, we have creases in our pants. We have boots. Yeah. So, and also the discipline and the sort of like, we hardly had any foreigners in East Germany. It was all very German and kind of behind the times, as it were. So I think that's got to be a big part of it too.
Don't miss the episode extras, such as videos, photos, and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.